The fluorescent lights of St. Mary's Hospital corridor flickered overhead as Genevieve Hart sat hunched in a plastic chair, her hands trembling as she clutched her phone. The text message from an unknown number glowed accusingly on the screen. "Your brother has 48 hours, $500,000 or he's done. We know where you work, where you live, where your grandmother stays. Don't test us." Genevieve's breath came in short, painful gasps. Marcus. Her foolish, impulsive, beloved younger brother had gotten himself into something she couldn't fix with love and stern lectures this time. Gambling debts to dangerous men, the kind who broke bones first and asked questions, never. She'd been visiting their grandmother when Marcus finally confessed everything, his face swollen from a beating that served as his first warning. Now, her grandmother lay in the hospital bed behind the closed door, her heart weakened by the stress of it all, and Genevieve felt the weight of both their lives crushing down on her 24-year-old shoulders. She worked as a librarian at the Riverside Public Library, earning $38,000 a year. Her savings account held exactly $4,312, money she'd been setting aside for her grandmother's medication. She had no assets, no rich relatives, no fairy godmother with a magic wand. The impossibility of the situation pressed against her chest like a physical weight, making it hard to breathe in the antiseptic hospital air. Her phone buzzed again. This time it was her Aunt Claire, her mother's sister who'd kept minimal contact with the family over the years. "I heard about Marcus. There might be a way. Call me immediately." Genevieve's fingers shook as she dialed. Aunt Claire answered on the first ring, her voice brisk and businesslike as always. "Genevieve, listen carefully. I work as an executive assistant for Blackstone Industries. My boss, Edward Blackstone, has a problem that your problem might solve." "I don't understand," Genevieve whispered, glancing around the empty corridor. "Edward Blackstone is one of the wealthiest men in the country. He's 35, brilliant, and absolutely ruthless in business. He's also facing an ultimatum from his grandfather, who controls the family trust that includes voting shares in the company. The old man is dying and refuses to hand over control unless Edward marries and settles down within the next month. Edward has no interest in love or romance. He finds the whole concept tedious. He needs a wife in name only, someone unremarkable enough not to cause complications when the arrangement ends after a year." Genevieve's stomach churned. "You want me to marry a stranger? I want you to save your brother's life and get paid handsomely for it. Edward is offering to cover any debts his contract wife might have, plus $2 million at the end of the year-long arrangement. It's a business transaction, nothing more. He'll draw up an airtight contract. You'll live in his penthouse, attend necessary social functions, and maintain the appearance of marriage. After 1 year, you'll divorce quietly, take your money, and disappear from his life. He's meeting potential candidates tomorrow. I can get you an interview." Every rational part of Genevieve's brain screamed that this was insane, that she should hang up and figure out another way. But there was no other way. Marcus would die, and it would be her fault for not acting when she had the chance. Her grandmother might follow from the grief and stress. She thought of her parents, killed in a senseless accident when she was 16, how they'd made her promise to always take care of Marcus and Grandma no matter what. "What time tomorrow?" she heard herself ask. Aunt Claire exhaled, relief evident. 10 o'clock, Blackstone Industries, 52nd floor. Wear something professional but modest. Don't be late. Edward despises tardiness almost as much as he despises inefficiency. The next morning, Genevieve stood before the gleaming glass tower that housed Blackstone Industries, feeling like she was about to walk into a lion's den wearing a meat dress. She'd worn her only professional outfit, a simple navy dress she'd bought for her library job interview 3 years ago, paired with modest heels that pinched her toes. Her long chestnut hair was pulled back in a neat bun, and she wore minimal makeup because she'd never quite mastered the art of cosmetic application. Looking at her reflection in the building's mirrored exterior, she saw exactly what she was: ordinary, unremarkable, forgettable. Perhaps that's exactly what Edward Blackstone wanted. The elevator ride to the 52nd floor felt like ascending to another world. Each floor that ticked by seemed to shed another layer of normalcy until she emerged into a reception area that screamed power and money. Everything was chrome, glass, and sharp angles, cold and intimidating, designed to make visitors feel small. The receptionist, a stunning woman with severe cheekbones and an even more severe expression, barely glanced at Genevieve before directing her to wait. Genevieve perched on the edge of a leather chair that probably cost more than her monthly rent, watching other women come and go from the corner office. They were all breathtaking, models, actresses, socialites with designer clothes and practiced smiles. Each emerged looking either furious or disappointed, their heels clicking aggressively against the marble as they departed. Whatever Edward Blackstone was looking for, apparently none of them had it. "Miss Hart, Mr. Blackstone will see you now." Aunt Claire appeared, her expression professionally neutral, though her eyes held a hint of encouragement. She led Genevieve down a hallway lined with abstract art that probably cost more than most people's houses, stopping before massive double doors. "Remember, be honest. Edward can smell deception a mile away. And don't be intimidated. He uses fear as a tool." The doors opened, and Genevieve stepped into an office that was less a workspace and more a monument to success. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a breathtaking view of the city skyline. The desk was a massive slab of dark wood that looked like it had been carved from a single ancient tree, and behind that desk sat Edward Blackstone. Genevieve's first thought was that her aunt had failed to mention how devastatingly attractive he was. Tall, she could tell even with him seated, with broad shoulders barely contained by an obviously custom-tailored charcoal suit. Dark hair, impeccably styled. A jaw that could have been carved from granite. But it was his eyes that caught and held her attention. Steel gray, sharp as broken glass, and completely devoid of warmth as they assessed her with the detached interest of a scientist examining a specimen. "Sit," he said, his voice deep and commanding, not bothering with pleasantries like "hello" or "nice to meet you." Genevieve sat in the chair across from his desk, folding her hands in her lap to hide their trembling. Edward continued studying her in silence, and she resisted the urge to fidget under that penetrating gaze. She'd read once that wolves established dominance through eye contact, that the first to look away was admitting defeat, so she met his stare steadily, even though everything in her wanted to drop her gaze to her lap. Something flickered in Edward's expression. Surprise, perhaps, or interest. "Your aunt tells me you need money urgently. Gambling debts." "My brother's gambling debts," Genevieve corrected quietly. $500,000 to dangerous people. He has 43 hours left to pay. And why should his mistakes become my problem? "They shouldn't," Genevieve admitted. "But you have a problem too, apparently. You need a wife who won't complicate your life or interfere with your business. Someone who'll fulfill the terms of your grandfather's ultimatum and then disappear quietly when the arrangement ends." "I need money to save my brother's life and take care of my grandmother's medical expenses. We can solve each other's problems." Edward leaned back in his chair, steepling his fingers beneath his chin. "You're different from the others. They simpered and flirted, thinking beauty would seal the deal. You look like a librarian who wandered into the wrong building." "I am a librarian," Genevieve said. "And I did wander into the wrong building. My building has books instead of aggressive modern art and terrified employees." Was that a hint of a smile tugging at the corner of his mouth? It vanished so quickly she might have imagined it. "Tell me about yourself, Miss Hart." "There's not much to tell. I'm 24. I've worked at Riverside Public Library for 3 years. I live in a small apartment in the Riverside district. I take care of my grandmother, who raised my brother and me after our parents died in a car accident when I was 16. I read constantly, mostly classic literature, some poetry. I don't have any social media presence to speak of. I've never been in trouble with the law. I don't drink excessively, don't use drugs, and I've only had one serious relationship that ended 2 years ago when he moved to Seattle for a job. As I said, not much to tell. Edward rose from his chair and walked to the windows, hands clasped behind his back. He stood there for a long moment, silhouetted against the city skyline like some kind of dark angel surveying his domain. If we proceed with this arrangement, there will be rules. You'll live in my penthouse, but in the guest quarters. We'll maintain separate spaces. You'll attend necessary social functions and play the role of devoted wife convincingly. No press interviews without my approval. No discussing the nature of our arrangement with anyone. After 1 year, we'll divorce quietly. You'll sign an ironclad NDA and prenuptial agreement. In exchange, I'll pay off your brother's debts immediately and deposit $2 million into an account in your name, accessible after the divorce is finalized. What if I fall in love with you? Genevieve asked, surprising herself with the bluntness of the question. Edward turned to face her, his expression hardening. You won't. I'm not a good man, Miss Hart. I'm cold, demanding, and married to my work. I built this empire from the ashes of my parents' death when I was 15 years old, and I did it by being ruthless and uncompromising. I don't do romance or tender feelings. I don't believe in love. I think it's a chemical reaction people romanticize to justify their biological impulses. If you're looking for a fairy tale, you're in the wrong office. I'm not looking for a fairy tale, Genevieve said, standing to face him. I'm looking for a way to save my brother's life, but I have one condition of my own. Edward's eyebrows rose slightly. You're in no position to make demands. Mutual respect, Genevieve said firmly. I'll fulfill every term of our contract, play whatever role you need me to play in public. But in private, we treat each other with basic human dignity. No cruelty for cruelty's sake. I'm not your employee or your possession. I'm entering a business arrangement, and I expect to be treated as an equal partner in that arrangement, even if the circumstances are unusual. The silence stretched between them, taut as a wire. Then Edward crossed the space between them in 3 long strides, extending his hand. You have a deal, Miss Hart. My lawyer will draw up the contracts. We'll marry at the courthouse Friday afternoon. Pack whatever you need. You'll move into the penthouse that evening. Genevieve shook his hand, and the moment their palms touched, an unexpected jolt of electricity shot up her arm. Edward's eyes widened fractionally, and she knew he'd felt it too. They both pulled back quickly, and Genevieve told herself it was just static electricity from the carpet, nothing more. But as she left his office, she couldn't shake the feeling that she'd just made a deal with the devil himself, and the price might be higher than she'd anticipated. Friday afternoon arrived with surreal swiftness. The contracts had been delivered, reviewed by the free legal aid lawyer Genevieve had managed to consult, and signed. Marcus's debts had been paid Wednesday night, and her brother was safe, his face still bruised, but his life no longer in immediate danger. Their grandmother had been discharged from the hospital Thursday, puzzled by Genevieve's announcement that she was getting married but too tired to ask many questions. The courthouse ceremony was clinical and cold. Edward arrived in a black suit that probably cost more than Genevieve's car, accompanied only by his lawyer, a thin man named Harrison, who served as their witness. Genevieve wore a simple cream-colored dress she'd bought on sale the day before, telling the saleswoman it was for a garden party because she couldn't bring herself to say wedding. The judge was a tired-looking woman in her 60s who'd clearly performed hundreds of these ceremonies. She recited the words with practiced efficiency, asking if they took each other to be lawfully wedded spouses. Edward's I do was firm and businesslike. Genevieve's came out as barely more than a whisper. When the judge pronounced them married and said Edward could kiss his bride, he simply placed a brief, perfunctory kiss on Genevieve's cheek. His lips barely brushed her skin, and yet she felt that contact like a brand. Then Edward slid a ring onto her finger, a large diamond solitaire that caught the fluorescent light and threw rainbow prisms across the judge's desk. It was beautiful and expensive and utterly devoid of sentiment, purchased by his assistant that morning from a high-end jeweler. Genevieve placed a simple platinum band on Edward's finger in return, and just like that, they were married. The entire ceremony had taken less than 10 minutes. Genevieve had spent longer in line at the coffee shop that morning. "I'll have a car collect you and your belongings at 7 this evening," Edward said as they left the courthouse, already checking his phone for messages. "Pack light. Anything you need will be provided. I have a meeting in 30 minutes. "Of course," Genevieve said to his retreating back as he climbed into a sleek black town car that whisked him away. She stood on the courthouse steps, a married woman, feeling more alone than she had in years. The penthouse was everything Genevieve had expected, and nothing she was prepared for. Located on the top floor of one of the city's most exclusive buildings, it was a study in modern luxury, all clean lines, expensive materials, and carefully curated art. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a panoramic view of the city that took her breath away. Everything was black, white, or gray, sophisticated and cold as a museum exhibit. Edward met her at the entrance, his jacket removed and tie loosened, the most casual she'd seen him. "I'll show you to your quarters." He led her down a hallway past several closed doors to a spacious suite at the opposite end of the penthouse from what she assumed was his bedroom. "You have a bedroom, bathroom, and sitting room, everything you should need. I've had the closet stocked with appropriate clothing. My assistant took the liberty of estimating your size. If anything doesn't fit, she'll arrange exchanges." Genevieve stepped into the room and found it as impersonally beautiful as the rest of the penthouse. The bed was enormous, dressed in white linens that looked like they'd never been slept in. The sitting room held a comfortable-looking couch, a reading chair, and bookshelves that were, heartbreakingly, empty. "I'm usually at the office until 8 or 9 in the evening," Edward continued, his tone suggesting he was reciting a prepared speech. "I work from home on Sunday afternoons. Mrs. Chen comes 3 times a week to clean, and can prepare meals if you let her know what you'd like. The kitchen is fully stocked. Help yourself to anything. I'll email you a calendar of events we'll need to attend together. Questions?" "Where's your room?" Genevieve asked, then immediately felt foolish. "I mean, just so I don't accidentally intrude." "Master Suite is at the opposite end of the penthouse. You won't intrude." The way he said it made clear he found the very idea absurd. "I'll let you settle in." He left, and Genevieve stood in the center of her beautiful, impersonal new room, feeling like a bird in a very luxurious cage. She unpacked her few belongings, her favorite books, her grandmother's quilt, a framed photo of her parents. They looked embarrassingly shabby among all this cold perfection. That first night, Genevieve lay awake in the enormous bed, surrounded by Egyptian cotton sheets and Hungarian goose-down pillows, missing her lumpy mattress and threadbare blanket. Somewhere in this huge apartment was her husband, a stranger who'd married her out of obligation and convenience. The ring on her finger felt heavy as a shackle. Unable to sleep, she finally gave up around midnight and wandered out of her room, thinking she'd get water from the kitchen. But as she passed through the main living area, she noticed a light coming from a room she hadn't seen during her brief tour. She peeked inside and found a library. It was the only room in the penthouse that felt lived in. Floor-to-ceiling bookshelves lined 3 walls, packed with everything from leather-bound classics to contemporary hardcovers. A worn leather chair sat beside a small table that held a crystal tumbler with 2 fingers of amber liquid. And in that chair, still dressed in his shirt and trousers, though his tie was long gone, sat Edward. He looked up as she entered, and for a moment his expression was unguarded, surprised, almost vulnerable. Then the mask slammed back into place. "Can't sleep?" "I didn't mean to intrude," Genevieve said, but found herself stepping into the room anyway, drawn by the books like a moth to flame. I didn't know you had a library. It's the only room in this place that doesn't feel like a showroom, Edward admitted, taking a sip of his drink. My interior designer was furious when I refused to let her organize it properly. Apparently, actual books are passé. I was supposed to have decorative objects arranged by color. Genevieve smiled despite herself, running her fingers along a shelf. I think I would have divorced you immediately if I'd found color-coordinated fake books. Our marriage is already fake. Would it have mattered? The words hung in the air between them, harsh and honest. Genevieve turned to face him. I suppose not. But this room isn't fake. These books have been read. There are notes in the margins, I can see from here. You actually use this space. Edward studied her for a long moment. You're different from what I expected. So are you, Genevieve said honestly. I thought you'd be, I don't know, more monstrous. You're just cold, unfeeling, married to my work, Edward supplied. Sad, Genevieve finished quietly. You look sad. Something flashed across Edward's face. Anger, maybe, or pain. You don't know anything about me, Miss Hart. It's Mrs. Blackstone now, Genevieve reminded him gently. And you're right, I don't know you. But I recognize grief when I see it. I've carried my own for 8 years. Edward stood abruptly, crossing to the window. When he spoke again, his voice was rough, stripped of its usual commanding tone. I was 15 when my parents died. Car accident. Drunk driver ran a red light. My father died instantly. My mother lingered for 3 days. I sat by her hospital bed and promised I'd take care of the family business, that I wouldn't let everything they'd built fall apart. She died believing I'd be okay. But you weren't, Genevieve said softly. I was a child left alone with a failing company, a grandfather who was already showing signs of dementia, and vultures circling to pick apart everything my parents had created. So I stopped being a child. I became ruthless because kindness was weakness. I became cold because emotions were liabilities. I built this empire by burying every soft part of myself so deep I forgot it existed. And now my grandfather, in one of his increasingly rare lucid moments, has decided I need a wife to make me human again. He laughed, but it was bitter. It's 20 years too late for that. Genevieve moved to stand beside him at the window, looking out at the glittering city below. My parents died when I was 16. It was raining, and a semi-truck jackknifed on the highway. They never had a chance. I remember the police officer at our door, how his hat dripped water onto our welcome mat. I remember thinking stupidly that I should get a towel so he wouldn't ruin the floor. And then he told us they were gone, and my whole world ended. Edward turned to look at her, really look at her, perhaps for the first time. How did you not become like me? I had my grandmother, Genevieve said simply, and Marcus, even though he was only 12 and I became more of a parent than a sister to him. I had to keep going because they needed me. I couldn't afford to shut down completely. There was no one else to hold us together. So I cried in the shower where they couldn't hear me, and I kept moving forward because stopping wasn't an option. But I understand the impulse to go cold and hard. Some days, I wanted to so badly. They stood in silence for a while, two wounded people who'd found themselves married to each other through circumstance rather than choice. Finally, Edward spoke again. I'm not going to fall in love with you, Genevieve. I can't. That part of me is dead. I know, she said, and found that she meant it. That's okay. We have an arrangement, nothing more. But as she returned to her room that night, Genevieve couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted between them in that library. They'd shared their grief, let their masks slip for just a moment. It wasn't love or even affection, but it was the first crack in the walls they'd both erected around their hearts. And Genevieve had spent enough time with old buildings to know that the smallest crack, left unattended, could eventually bring the whole structure down. The first few weeks of her marriage to Edward passed in a strange sort of limbo. They existed in the same space like polite strangers, orbiting each other carefully, maintaining their separate lives while sharing an address. Edward left for the office before dawn and rarely returned before 9 in the evening. When he was home, he sequestered himself in his study or the library, always working, always driven by the relentless ambition that had built his empire. Genevieve took leave from her library job, telling her colleagues she was dealing with a family emergency, which wasn't entirely untrue, even if the family now included a husband who barely acknowledged her existence. But something subtle was shifting, so gradually that neither of them consciously acknowledged it at first. Genevieve had always been an early riser, a habit from years of getting Marcus ready for school before rushing to her own classes. She'd wake at 6, make coffee in the gleaming kitchen that looked like it had never been used, and curl up in the living room with a book as the city awakened below. On her 4th morning in the penthouse, she found Edward already in the kitchen, standing at the espresso machine with a look of barely controlled frustration. "It's broken," he announced without preamble, jabbing at buttons with increasing aggression. "I'm going to fire whoever selected this monstrosity. Or you could just make regular coffee," Genevieve suggested, slipping past him to the cupboard. "I've been using the French press. It's actually quite good." She showed him the simple process: heating water, measuring grounds, the 4-minute steep. Edward watched with the intense focus he probably applied to merger negotiations, and when he finally tasted the result, something in his expression softened. "This is better than the espresso machine ever produced." "Sometimes simple is better," Genevieve said, pouring her own cup. The next morning, when Genevieve emerged from her room, she found a fresh pot of coffee waiting, still hot, with a note in bold handwriting. "Thank you for the lesson. E." Small things accumulated. Edward noticed Genevieve preferred English breakfast tea in the afternoons and made sure Mrs. Chen kept it stocked. Genevieve observed that Edward constantly lost his reading glasses and created a small basket system in each room where he could leave them. He hated clutter, but never commented when she left books on the side tables, their pages marked with whatever she'd been using as a bookmark. She organized his study one weekend while he was at the office, not changing anything substantively, but creating a system that made his mountains of paperwork more manageable. He came home, surveyed the changes, and simply said, "Thank you." But his eyes held genuine gratitude. They fell into a rhythm. Edward would come home around 9, usually looking exhausted, and if Genevieve was still awake, she'd hear him head to the library with a drink. One night, she knocked softly on the open door, holding a plate. "Mrs. Chen left dinner. You haven't eaten." "I'm not hungry," he said, without looking up from the contract he was reviewing. "You haven't eaten since breakfast. I watched you leave this morning with just coffee." Genevieve set the plate down beside him. "You can't run an empire if you collapse from malnutrition." Edward looked up then, and she saw the exhaustion in his eyes, the weight he carried. "It's a crucial acquisition. If I don't have this perfect by tomorrow, it will still be there after you eat," Genevieve said firmly. 20 minutes. That's all I'm asking. Take care of yourself, Edward." He stared at her for a long moment, then set down his pen. They ate together in the library, mostly in silence, but it was a comfortable silence. Edward asked about her day, and Genevieve found herself telling him about the book she was reading, getting animated as she described the plot. He listened, actually listened, and she could see his mind working, making connections, thinking about what she said. "You light up when you talk about books," he observed. "It's the most alive I've seen you look." "Books are where I escape to," Genevieve admitted. "After my parents died, I practically lived in the library. It was the only place where I could be somewhere else, someone else, for a while. I knew I wanted to be a librarian when I was 17. I wanted to be the person who helped other people find their escape doors." "That's a good reason," Edward said quietly. "Better than most people have for their careers. And you? Why continue your father's business instead of doing something of your own?" Edward's expression darkened. It was his legacy. Walking away felt like letting him die twice, once physically, and once by letting his life's work disappear. I was angry at him for years for dying and leaving me alone. Building his company bigger and stronger became my way of honoring him and punishing him simultaneously. That's exhausting, Genevieve said softly. Yes, Edward agreed. It is. Their first public appearance as a married couple came 3 weeks after the wedding. The annual Blackstone Industries Charity Gala was one of the social events of the season, and Edward's absence or appearance with a new wife would be equally newsworthy. He'd had his assistant arrange for a personal stylist to meet with Genevieve, and she'd spent an uncomfortable afternoon being measured, assessed, and dressed like a doll. The night of the gala, Genevieve emerged from her room in a floor-length emerald gown that the stylist had insisted was perfect. The dress was elegant without being ostentatious, the green bringing out the flecks of gold in her hazel eyes. Her hair was swept up in a sophisticated updo, and she wore minimal jewelry, just the diamond ring that felt heavy on her finger and matching earrings that had appeared in a jewelry box outside her door that morning. Edward was waiting in the living room, devastating in a tuxedo that had clearly been tailored specifically for his frame. He looked up as she approached, and his expression, carefully neutral for weeks, cracked. His eyes widened, and he stared at her as if seeing her for the first time. "You look—" He seemed to struggle for words. "That color is perfect on you." "Your assistant chose it," Genevieve said, suddenly self-conscious under his scrutiny. "My assistant has excellent taste." Edward crossed to her, and for a moment they simply stood looking at each other. Then he offered his arm. "Ready to face the wolves?" The gala was everything Genevieve had feared and more. Held in a historic hotel ballroom, it was a sea of designer gowns, expensive jewelry, and people who measured worth in zeros. The moment they entered, a hush fell across the nearest groups, and Genevieve felt hundreds of eyes turn toward them. Speculative, calculating, hungry for gossip about Edward Blackstone's mysterious bride. Edward's hand moved to the small of her back, a gesture that looked possessive but felt protective. He guided her through the crowd, introducing her to what felt like hundreds of people whose names she immediately forgot. Business associates, board members, society matrons who looked at her like she was a puzzle to be solved. Everyone wanted to know where Edward had found her, how they'd met, why the wedding had been so sudden and private. Edward deflected every intrusive question with practiced ease, his responses polite, but firmly establishing that their private life was not up for discussion. But Genevieve could feel the tension in his body, the way his jaw tightened when one particularly bold socialite suggested that their quick marriage must mean Genevieve was pregnant. "Dance with me," Edward said suddenly, leading her toward the dance floor before she could respond. He pulled her into his arms as a waltz began, one hand at her waist, the other clasping hers. They were suddenly close, closer than they'd ever been, except for that brief, perfunctory kiss at their wedding. "I'm sorry," Edward said quietly as they moved across the floor. "I should have prepared you better for how intrusive these people can be." "It's fine," Genevieve said, though her heart was racing. From the crowds or his proximity, she wasn't sure. "I understand. You're a public figure. Your life is news. It shouldn't be. What we are to each other is nobody's business but ours." Genevieve looked up at him and found him already watching her with an intensity that made her breath catch. His hand at her waist pulled her infinitesimally closer until there was barely any space between them. She was acutely aware of everywhere they touched. His palm against hers, his hand at her back. The way their bodies moved in perfect synchronization, as if they'd been dancing together for years instead of minutes. "Edward," she started to say, but was interrupted by another couple bumping into them, the man already clearly drunk despite the early hour. "Blackstone," Heard you finally took the plunge. About time. The man leered at Genevieve in a way that made her skin crawl. Though I have to say, if I'd known you were in the market for a wife, I could have introduced you to my niece. She's a model, you know, much more suited to the society page than D. Careful, Edward said, his voice dropping to a dangerous register that Genevieve had never heard before. You're speaking about my wife. The temperature around them seemed to plummet. The drunk man sobered slightly, backing away with raised hands. No offense meant, old boy. But offense given, Edward replied coldly. You'll excuse us. He led Genevieve off the dance floor and through a side door into a quiet corridor. Once they were alone, Edward ran a hand through his hair, disrupting its perfect styling. Are you all right? I'm fine, Genevieve assured him. I've dealt with worse at the library. You wouldn't believe some of the things patrons say. That's not the point. Edward's hands clenched into fists. You shouldn't have to deal with it here. You're doing me a favor by being here, by playing this role, and I should have known they'd... He broke off, looking genuinely angry with himself. Edward! Genevieve stepped closer, placing her hand on his arm. I'm okay, really. But thank you for defending me. He looked down at her hand on his arm, then back up at her face. They were close again. This time in the intimate quiet of the empty corridor. Genevieve could see the rapid pulse in his throat, could feel the heat radiating from his body. The air between them felt charged with something electric and dangerous. We should go back, Edward said, but he didn't move. Yes, Genevieve agreed, but she didn't move either. For a long moment, they stood frozen in that hallway, on the precipice of something neither was ready to name. Then Edward stepped back, offering his arm again. Come, let's survive the rest of this circus together. They made it through the remainder of the evening as a unit, presenting a united front against the curious and the crude. And when they finally escaped to Edward's car well past midnight, both of them exhausted, Genevieve realized that something fundamental had shifted. They'd stopped being two strangers fulfilling a contract and become something else. Not quite friends, not quite partners, but not strangers anymore either. In the car, Edward loosened his tie and leaned his head back against the seat. I hate these events. Then why have them? Genevieve asked, slipping off her heels with a sigh of relief. Because the charity work is important, and these people have money to donate if you give them an open bar and the chance to see and be seen. He turned his head to look at her. You were remarkable tonight. I know it wasn't easy. Neither was defending my honor to that drunk idiot, but you did it anyway. That wasn't difficult at all, Edward said quietly. Any man who looks at you with anything less than respect deserves worse than cold words. Genevieve's breath caught at the unexpected compliment. You don't have to say things like that. There's no one here to overhear. I know. Edward held her gaze. I'm saying it because it's true. They arrived back at the penthouse, and the spell of the evening seemed to break in the harsh light of the foyer. Edward bid her good night and disappeared toward his room, leaving Genevieve standing alone, her heart racing for reasons she didn't want to examine too closely. The following week brought an unexpected heat wave that pushed temperatures into the 90s. The penthouse's air conditioning kept the interior comfortable, but Genevieve found herself restless, unused to being confined indoors for days. She'd taken to doing yoga in the morning in the living room, a habit from her apartment days when she couldn't afford a gym membership. She was in downward dog, wearing yoga pants and a fitted tank top, when she heard Edward's voice behind her. I didn't realize you did yoga. Genevieve looked back between her legs, to find Edward standing in the kitchen doorway in gym clothes, apparently on his way out for a run. From her inverted position, she had an excellent view of his legs, and found herself suddenly very aware that those suit pants he always wore hid a considerable amount of athletic muscle. She straightened, feeling her cheeks flush. I try to practice most mornings. Helps clear my head. Edward's gaze traveled over her in a way it never had before, taking in her athletic clothes, her slightly sweaty skin, her hair pulled back in a messy bun. Something heated flickered in his eyes before he shuttered it. "I usually run at this time. I haven't been because I didn't want to disturb you." "You're not disturbing me," Genevieve said, acutely aware of how little clothing she was wearing, how his eyes kept drifting to her legs, her shoulders, places he'd never looked before. "This is your home. Don't change your routine for me." "It's your home too now," Edward said, then seemed surprised he'd said it. "I'll try not to interrupt your practice." But the next morning he appeared again, and this time he had a yoga mat. "Would you mind if I joined you? I used to do yoga years ago. My physical therapist recommended it after a car accident. I've gotten out of the habit." So began a new routine. Every morning at 6:30, they met in the living room and moved through poses together. Edward was less flexible than Genevieve, but stronger, and she found herself watching the way his muscles moved beneath his shirt, the focused determination he brought to even this simple activity. They didn't talk much during these sessions, but the shared quiet felt intimate in a way that conversation couldn't match. One morning, Genevieve was attempting a particularly challenging balance pose and wobbled. Edward caught her instinctively, his hands at her waist, steadying her. They froze, suddenly pressed together, both breathing hard from exertion. His hands were warm through the thin fabric of her top. Her palms had landed on his chest, and she could feel his heart racing beneath her touch. "Thank you," she whispered. "You're welcome," he replied, but neither of them moved. The moment stretched. Edward's eyes dropped to her lips, and Genevieve's breath caught. She thought he might kiss her, wanted him to kiss her, she realized with a jolt. But then his phone rang from the kitchen counter, shattering the moment. Edward stepped back abruptly, and they didn't speak of it, returning to their poses as if nothing had happened. But something had happened. They both felt it, this pull between them that was growing stronger, despite their best efforts to maintain professional distance. It manifested in little ways, Edward's hand lingering at her back when they passed each other in the hallway. Genevieve unconsciously touching his arm when she talked to him. The way their eyes met across rooms and held longer than necessary. The breaking point came on a Friday evening 3 weeks after the gala. Edward came home around 7, early for him, looking exhausted and frustrated. Genevieve was in the kitchen, having convinced Mrs. Chen to teach her how to make Edward's favorite soup, a recipe his grandmother had made. She'd wanted to do something nice, to ease some of the constant tension he carried. "You're home early," she said, looking up from the pot she was stirring. Meetings ran long but went nowhere. Everyone had opinions and no solutions. He loosened his tie, then froze, actually noticing what she was doing. "Is that your grandmother's soup? Mrs. Chen gave me the recipe. I thought you might like something comforting after a long week." Edward stared at her, and to Genevieve's shock, his eyes looked suspiciously bright. "No one's made this for me since she died 5 years ago." "Oh," Genevieve said softly. "I'm sorry. I didn't mean to. Don't apologize." Edward crossed to her, stopping close enough that she had to tilt her head back to meet his eyes. "This is the kindest thing anyone's done for me in longer than I can remember. Thank you." They had dinner together at the kitchen island, something they'd never done before, usually maintaining the pretense of separate lives even when they ate at the same time. Edward told her about his day, actually venting about the incompetent board members and the acquisition that was falling apart despite his best efforts. Genevieve listened, asked questions, offered the perspective of someone outside the corporate world. And slowly, she watched Edward relax, the tension bleeding out of his shoulders, his expression softening. After dinner, they migrated to the library with wine, a bottle of red that Edward claimed was too good to waste, but not so good he'd cry if she didn't like it. They sat in comfortable chairs flanking the fireplace that Edward turned on despite the summer heat, because Genevieve admitted she loved the ambiance of a fire. "Tell me something about yourself I don't know," Edward said, swirling his wine. "I can't ride a bike," Genevieve admitted. "Never learned. My parents meant to teach me, but then they died, and my grandmother couldn't, and it seemed stupid to learn as a teenager." "I'll teach you," Edward said immediately. "Why?" "Because everyone should know how to ride a bike, and because I want to." He met her eyes over his wine glass. "Tell me something else." "I'm afraid of birds. Not all birds, just pigeons and seagulls. The ones that get aggressive. I was attacked by a flock of geese when I was 7, and I've never quite gotten over it." Edward laughed, an actual laugh, deep and genuine, and Genevieve realized she'd never heard him laugh before. The sound transformed his face, making him look years younger, almost boyish. "A flock of geese? That's the most endearing thing I've ever heard." "Your turn," Genevieve said. "Tell me something I don't know." "I wanted to be an architect," Edward said quietly. "Before my parents died, I was obsessed with buildings, with design. I had notebooks full of sketches, but after the accident, there was the company to run, and architecture became an impossible dream." "Do you still sketch?" "Sometimes, late at night when I can't sleep, but I never show anyone." "Would you show me?" Genevieve asked softly. Edward studied her for a long moment, then stood and went to one of the bookshelves. He pulled out what looked like a leather-bound book, but turned out to be a sketchbook. Returning to his chair, he handed it to her. Genevieve opened it reverently, finding page after page of incredible drawings, buildings both real and imagined, structural details, innovative designs that took her breath away. "Edward, these are incredible. You have real talent." "They're just a hobby," he said, but she could hear the pleased note in his voice. "They're more than that. They're beautiful." She looked up at him. "Thank you for showing me." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, finishing their wine. Then Edward said quietly, "I'm glad you're here, Genevieve. I didn't expect that. To be glad. But this place feels less empty with you in it." "I'm glad I'm here too," Genevieve admitted. "Even though this whole situation is insane and we barely know each other, and this isn't what either of us planned." "No," Edward agreed, his eyes intense on hers. "It's not what I planned at all." The air between them thickened with unspoken words, with all the things they weren't saying. Genevieve set down her wineglass with trembling hands. Edward did the same, his movements careful, deliberate. They stood simultaneously, as if pulled by the same invisible force. "Genevieve," Edward said, his voice rough, "if we cross this line—" "I know," she whispered. "It changes everything." "Yes." They stood there, the fire crackling between them, the whole world narrowed down to this moment, this choice. Then Genevieve stepped forward, closing the distance, and Edward's control shattered. He kissed her like a man drowning, his hands cupping her face, his mouth hungry and desperate on hers. Genevieve melted into him, her hands fisting in his shirt, kissing him back with equal fervor. All the weeks of tension, of careful distance, of pretending they didn't feel this pull between them, it all exploded in that kiss. Edward backed her against the bookshelf, and Genevieve gasped as her back hit the wood. He took advantage of her open mouth to deepen the kiss, his tongue sliding against hers in a way that made her knees weak. His hands moved from her face to her waist, pulling her flush against him, and she could feel the evidence of his arousal pressing against her stomach. "God, Genevieve," he breathed against her lips. "I've wanted to do this for weeks, every morning, watching you stretch, seeing you in those little yoga outfits. Do you have any idea what you do to me?" "Tell me," she whispered, emboldened by desire. "You walk through my home leaving books everywhere like breadcrumbs, and I follow them because they lead to you. You make me coffee in the morning and I drink it like it's some kind of prayer. You organized my office and I haven't been able to work anywhere else since because it smells like your perfume. You've invaded every corner of my life and I can't stop thinking about you." Genevieve pulled him down for another kiss, this one slower but no less intense. Edward lifted her easily and her legs wrapped around his waist instinctively. He carried her like she weighed nothing, navigating through the penthouse without breaking the kiss, his hands supporting her, his mouth never leaving hers. They ended up in his bedroom, a space Genevieve had never seen before. It was as elegant as the rest of the penthouse, but somehow more personal. A massive bed with dark sheets, architectural photography on the walls, a wall of windows overlooking the city. Edward set her down beside the bed, his hands shaking slightly as they moved to the hem of her shirt. He paused, meeting her eyes. "Tell me to stop. If you don't want this, tell me now, because in another minute I won't be able to." "I don't want you to stop," Genevieve said clearly. "I want this. I want you." Edward closed his eyes briefly, as if in prayer or pain, then pulled her shirt over her head. His hands moved to her yoga pants, sliding them down, and Genevieve stepped out of them, standing before him in just her simple cotton bra and underwear. Nothing fancy, nothing seductive, just practical undergarments that she'd never expected anyone to see. "You're so beautiful," Edward said roughly, his eyes roaming over her like a physical touch. "So damn beautiful, and I don't deserve this, don't deserve you, but I'm too selfish to walk away." He kissed her again, walking her backward until her legs hit the bed. They fell together onto the mattress, and Edward's weight settling over her felt right in a way that terrified and exhilarated her. His hands explored her body with a reverence that made her feel cherished, desired, seen in a way she'd never experienced before. Genevieve's hands fumbled with the buttons of his shirt, desperate to feel his skin against hers. Edward helped her, shrugging out of the expensive fabric and tossing it aside carelessly. His chest was sculpted, defined muscles that testified to hours in the gym, and Genevieve ran her hands over the warm skin, feeling his sharp intake of breath. Edward unhooked her bra with practiced ease, and Genevieve felt a moment of shyness. She wasn't like the women he probably usually slept with, sophisticated and experienced. But when his eyes met hers, there was nothing but wonder and desire. "Perfect," he murmured, his hands cupping her breasts, thumbs brushing over sensitive peaks that made her arch into his touch. "You're perfect." His mouth followed his hands, and Genevieve gasped at the sensation, her fingers threading through his hair. Edward took his time, lavishing attention on her breasts until she was writhing beneath him, making small sounds she'd never heard herself make before. "Edward, please," she gasped, not even sure what she was asking for. "I know, sweetheart. I know." His hands moved to her underwear, sliding the fabric down her legs. "God, Genevieve, you're so responsive. Do you feel what you do to me?" He pressed against her, and even through his pants she could feel him, hard and ready. Her hands moved to his belt, fumbling with the buckle in her eagerness. Edward helped her, kicking off his pants and boxer briefs until there was nothing between them but air and anticipation. Genevieve's eyes widened. She'd seen anatomy diagrams, had read romance novels, but nothing had prepared her for the reality of Edward naked and aroused, his body magnificent in the dim light filtering through the windows. Edward noticed her reaction and froze. "Genevieve? Are you okay? We can stop if—" "I'm fine," she said quickly. I've never—" The words died on her lips, but understanding dawned on Edward's face. He went very still above her. "You've never— Genevieve, are you telling me you're a virgin?" She felt her cheeks flame. "I told you I'd only had one serious relationship, and we broke up before we ever— I'm sorry, I should have mentioned it, but I didn't think we'd ever—" "Don't apologize," Edward cut her off, his voice tight. "Never apologize for that. But Genevieve, your first time shouldn't be like this. It should be special, With someone you love. Someone who what? Cares about me? Respects me? Makes me feel desired and safe? Genevieve cupped his face, forcing him to meet her eyes. That's exactly what this is, Edward. I want this. I want you. Please don't pull away now. Edward closed his eyes, clearly warring with himself. When he opened them again, the heat in his gaze made her breath catch. Okay, but we're doing this right. I'm going to make this so good for you, Genevieve. I promise. He kissed her deeply, thoroughly, until she was pliant and relaxed beneath him. Then his mouth began a journey south, kissing and tasting every inch of her skin. When he reached her thighs, gently urging them apart, Genevieve tensed. Relax, sweetheart, Edward murmured against her inner thigh. Let me take care of you. His mouth found her center, and Genevieve's back arched off the bed at the first touch of his tongue. Nothing in her limited experience had prepared her for this, for the pleasure that built with every stroke, every skilled movement of his mouth. Edward worked her expertly, paying attention to her responses, learning what made her gasp and writhe. Edward, I can't. It's too much, she gasped, feeling something building inside her, a pressure that was almost frightening in its intensity. Let go, he commanded against her. Let me see you fall apart. And she did, crying out as waves of pleasure crashed over her, her body shaking with the force of her first orgasm. Edward gentled her through it, his touches soft and soothing, until she collapsed back against the pillows, panting. That was, she started, but couldn't find words. That was just the beginning, Edward said, kissing his way back up her body. He reached into his nightstand, withdrawing a condom, and Genevieve watched through heavy-lidded eyes as he rolled it on with practiced efficiency. He positioned himself at her entrance, his eyes locked on hers. This might hurt at first. Tell me if you need me to stop. Genevieve nodded, and Edward began to push inside slowly, so slowly. She felt the stretch, the burn of intrusion, but Edward's earlier ministrations had prepared her, made her body ready. Still, when he encountered the barrier of her innocence, she tensed. Breathe, Edward instructed, his own breath ragged. Just breathe through it. He pushed forward in one smooth motion, and Genevieve gasped at the sharp pain, her fingernails digging into his shoulders. Edward immediately stilled, buried inside her, his whole body tense with the effort of not moving. You never told me you are this tight, he gasped, his voice strained. God, Genevieve, you feel incredible. But are you okay? Did I hurt you? I'm okay, she managed, though the fullness was overwhelming. Just give me a minute. Edward held himself utterly still, kissing her gently, whispering praise and endearments until she felt her body begin to adjust, the pain fading to a dull ache. She experimentally shifted her hips, and both of them groaned at the sensation. You can move, she told him. I'm ready. Edward began to move, slow and careful, each thrust measured and controlled. His eyes never left hers, watching her face for any sign of discomfort. But as her body adjusted, as the pain gave way entirely to pleasure, Genevieve found herself meeting his thrusts, urging him deeper, faster. More, she breathed. Edward, please, more. Edward's control shattered. His thrusts deepened, quickened, and Genevieve wrapped her legs around his waist, pulling him closer, deeper. The bed rocked with their movements, and Genevieve discovered muscles she hadn't known she possessed, discovered pleasure she'd never imagined. Look at me, Edward commanded, and she realized her eyes had drifted closed. She opened them to find his face above hers, intense and focused entirely on her. I want to see you when you come again. I want to watch you fall apart on me. His hand slipped between their bodies, finding that sensitive bundle of nerves, and Genevieve shattered again, crying out his name. Edward followed moments later, his own release tearing through him as he buried his face against her neck, her name a prayer on his lips. They collapsed together, both breathing hard, their bodies slick with sweat. Edward carefully withdrew and disposed of the condom, then immediately pulled Genevieve back into his arms, cradling her against his chest. "How do you feel?" he asked, pressing a kiss to her temple. "Sore," Genevieve admitted, "but also amazing. I never knew it could be like that." "It's not always like that," Edward said quietly, his fingers trailing patterns on her bare shoulder. "That was special. You're special." They lay in comfortable silence for a while, the only sound their gradually slowing breathing and the distant hum of the city below. Genevieve felt herself drifting toward sleep, warm and sated and utterly content in Edward's arms. "Stay," Edward murmured against her hair. "Sleep here tonight. Let me hold you." "Okay," Genevieve whispered, already half asleep. As she drifted off, she felt Edward press another kiss to her forehead. Heard him whisper something that might have been, "I'm in trouble," or might have been her imagination. But wrapped in his arms, in his bed, their bodies still tangled together, Genevieve couldn't bring herself to care about the complications that would come with morning light. For now, this moment was perfect, and that was enough. Genevieve woke to sunlight streaming through unfamiliar windows and the warm weight of Edward's arm across her waist. For a moment, she lay perfectly still, processing where she was and what had happened. She was in Edward's bed. She'd slept with Edward. She'd given him her virginity, and it had been everything she'd secretly hoped for, and nothing like she'd expected. She shifted slightly and immediately felt the soreness between her legs, a physical reminder of the night before. Edward stirred beside her, his arm tightening around her waist, pulling her back against his chest. "Morning," he murmured against her neck, his voice sleep-rough and intimate. "Good morning," Genevieve replied, acutely aware of her nakedness, of his nakedness pressed against her back, of the very different dynamic between them now. Edward pressed a kiss to her shoulder. "How do you feel? Are you sore?" "A little," she admitted. "I'll run you a bath. That'll help." Edward slipped out of bed, gloriously unself-conscious in his nudity, and disappeared into what she assumed was his bathroom. She heard water running, and moments later he returned, scooping her up effortlessly. "Edward! I can walk!" she protested, even as her arms automatically circled his neck. "Humor me," he said, carrying her into the most luxurious bathroom she'd ever seen. He'd filled the enormous soaking tub with steaming water and what looked like bath salts. He lowered her gently into the water, and Genevieve sighed as the heat soothed her aching muscles. Edward knelt beside the tub, his expression soft in a way she'd never seen before. "Thank you," he said quietly, "for last night, for trusting me with something so precious." "Thank you for making it special," Genevieve replied, reaching out to touch his face. Edward caught her hand, pressing a kiss to her palm. "I should make us breakfast. Take your time." After her bath, Genevieve wrapped herself in the plush robe hanging on the back of the door and padded out to the kitchen, following the smell of coffee and something delicious. She found Edward at the stove, wearing low-slung pajama pants and nothing else, his back muscles flexing as he worked. He'd made pancakes, eggs, and had fresh fruit arranged on plates. "You cook?" Genevieve asked, surprised. "I have many hidden talents," Edward replied with a small smile. "I lived alone for years before hiring Mrs. Chen. It was either learn to cook or survive on takeout." They ate together at the kitchen island, and the domesticity of it was both comfortable and terrifying. This wasn't part of their arrangement. Contract marriages didn't include morning-after breakfasts and tender care. But neither of them acknowledged the shift, both pretending this was somehow still within the bounds of their agreement. Over the following weeks, their physical relationship intensified. Every surface of the penthouse became a potential site for passion. Edward would come home from work and find Genevieve reading in the library, and they'd barely make it to the couch. She'd wake to find him already awake, watching her with heated eyes, and they'd start the morning tangled together. They made love in his shower, against the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city, in the kitchen late at night when neither could sleep. Edward was an attentive lover, learning her body with the same intense focus he applied to business deals. He discovered that she was ticklish behind her knees, that she loved having her hair pulled gently during sex, that she made the most intoxicating sounds when he used his mouth on her. And Genevieve learned him too, learned that he loved when she took control, that he was surprisingly vocal during sex, that he had a sensitive spot at the base of his spine that made him crazy. But even as their physical connection deepened, Edward maintained emotional distance. He never stayed in bed after they finished making love, always finding a reason to return to work or his study. He never spoke of feelings or the future beyond the terms of their contract. When Genevieve would sometimes reach for his hand while they watched a movie, he'd accept the touch but never initiate it himself. Genevieve tried to pretend it didn't hurt, that she could separate physical intimacy from emotional connection the way Edward seemed able to. But the truth was, she was falling in love with her husband. Maybe she'd started falling that first night in the library when he'd shared his grief. Maybe it happened gradually over morning coffees and shared yoga sessions. Or maybe it was inevitable from the moment he'd defended her honor at the gala, looking at her like she was someone worth protecting. She loved his hidden softness, the way he'd leave post-it notes with architectural facts he thought she'd find interesting, the way he always made sure her favorite tea was stocked, the way he looked at her sometimes when he thought she wasn't paying attention, like she was a puzzle he was desperate to solve. She loved his dedication, his intelligence, the way he could be ruthless in business but tender with her. She loved him, completely and hopelessly, and it was destroying her because she knew he couldn't love her back. The crisis came when Edward's grandfather's health took a turn for the worse. Edward received the call early one Tuesday morning, and Genevieve watched his face go pale as he listened. He ended the call and stood frozen in the middle of the bedroom, still wearing only his pajama pants, looking lost in a way she'd never seen. "Edward?" she asked softly, touching his arm. "My grandfather had a stroke. They don't know if he'll make it through the night." His voice was flat, emotionless, but she could see the white-knuckle grip he had on his phone. "I need to go to the hospital." "I'll come with you," Genevieve said immediately, already moving toward her room to get dressed. "No." The word came out sharp. "This is family business. You don't need to be there." The words hit like a slap. After everything they'd shared, after weeks of intimacy and growing closeness, he still saw her as an outsider, just a contractor fulfilling her obligations. "Of course," Genevieve said, keeping her voice steady even as something inside her cracked. "I'll be here if you need anything." Edward left without another word, and Genevieve spent the day trying not to fall apart. He'd been gone before, of course. He practically lived at his office. But this felt different. This felt like rejection, like a reminder that despite everything, their relationship had an expiration date, and emotional entanglement was never part of the deal. Edward came home late that night, exhausted and drawn. His grandfather had stabilized, but remained in critical condition. Without being asked, Genevieve made him dinner, poured him a drink, ran him a bath. She took care of him the way she'd learned he needed to be taken care of, quietly, without demanding conversation or emotional processing. That night, they made love with a desperate edge, Edward clinging to her like she was his anchor in a storm. But afterward, as usual, he retreated to his study, leaving Genevieve alone in his bed, wondering how much longer she could keep doing this before it broke her completely. The pattern continued for 2 weeks. Edward would spend his days at the hospital, come home emotionally drained, seek comfort in Genevieve's body, then pull away before any real intimacy could develop. And Genevieve let him, because she loved him and couldn't bear to deny him whatever comfort he would accept, even if it was killing her to be so close and yet so far away. Finally, his grandfather recovered enough to receive visitors. Edward took Genevieve with him, for appearances, she assumed, though he claimed the old man had specifically asked to meet his grandson's bride. Jonathan Blackstone was a diminished version of the man in the photographs throughout the penthouse, but his eyes were still sharp as they assessed Genevieve. "So, you're the girl who got my grandson to finally settle down. It's wonderful to meet you, Mr. Blackstone," Genevieve said politely. "Call me Jonathan. We're family now, aren't we?" His gaze shifted to Edward. "Leave us. I want to talk to your wife alone." Edward's jaw tightened. "Grandfather, go!" Jonathan commanded, his voice surprisingly strong for someone who'd nearly died. "I won't bite her. Much." After Edward reluctantly left, Jonathan gestured for Genevieve to sit beside his bed. "You love him?" It wasn't a question, but Genevieve found herself nodding anyway. "Yes. And he's too much of an idiot to see it, or too scared to admit it if he does." Jonathan sighed. "My grandson has many talents. Emotional intelligence isn't one of them. He thinks feelings are weaknesses. That letting anyone close is inviting pain. Losing his parents broke something in him, and I wasn't well enough to help him heal. Instead, I let him bury himself in work, in building this empire, in becoming a machine." "He's not a machine," Genevieve said softly. "He's kind and thoughtful, and so much more than he lets people see." "But he doesn't let you see it either, does he?" "Not really. Not all of it." Jonathan reached out with a trembling hand to pat hers. "I made him marry as a condition of his inheritance because I knew if I didn't force the issue, he'd end up alone and miserable for the rest of his life. I hoped maybe a wife would crack that armor he wears, but I didn't expect him to marry someone who actually cares about him. Most of the women who chase Edward want his money or his status." "You want him?" "Yes," Genevieve whispered. "Then fight for him, girl, because he's running scared, and men like Edward don't know how to stop running once they start. They'll run until they've destroyed everything good in their lives because they think that's safer than risking their hearts." Jonathan's grip tightened. "Don't let him run from you. Make him face what he feels. It's the only way he'll ever be happy." Genevieve left that conversation shaken, Jonathan's words echoing in her head. She'd been so focused on respecting Edward's boundaries, on not pushing for more than he could give, that she hadn't considered that maybe what he needed was to be pushed. Maybe his walls needed to be torn down rather than tiptoed around. But before she could figure out how to do that, everything came to a head in the worst possible way. 3 days after visiting Jonathan, Edward came home from work with an expression Genevieve had never seen before, closed off, almost cruel. "We need to talk," he said, his voice cold. Genevieve felt her stomach drop. "Okay. My grandfather is recovering well. The doctors say he'll make a full recovery. He's already talking about returning to his home next week." Edward stood by the windows, silhouetted against the city lights, not looking at her. "Which means the immediate crisis is over. We can start planning the endgame of our arrangement." "Endgame?" Genevieve repeated, her voice barely above a whisper. "The contract was for 1 year. We're nearly 4 months in. I think we should start discussing divorce proceedings. Not immediately. We'll need to maintain appearances for a reasonable period to avoid suspicion. But perhaps in another 6 months we can begin the separation process." Each word landed like a blow. "I see. It's what we agreed to," Edward continued, still not looking at her. "A business arrangement. 1 year, then we both move on with our lives." "And the past few weeks?" Genevieve asked, her voice gaining strength from anger. "What was that, Edward? Just convenient sex to pass the time?" "We're both adults. We acted on mutual attraction. It doesn't change the fundamental nature of our arrangement. Look at me, Genevieve demanded. When Edward didn't turn, she crossed to him, grabbing his arm and forcing him to face her. Look at me and tell me you feel nothing. Tell me that these past weeks meant nothing to you. Tell me I'm just a convenient body and a contract you're eager to be free of. Edward's jaw clenched, but he met her eyes. What do you want me to say? That I care about you? Fine, I care about you. You're a good person, Genevieve. You deserve someone who can give you what you need. That's not me. How do you know what I need? Genevieve felt tears threatening but refused to let them fall. You've never asked. You've never talked to me about anything beyond surface pleasantries and what we're doing in bed. You won't let me in, Edward. Every time I try to get close, you pull away. Because this has an expiration date. Edward's control cracked, his voice rising. Because in 8 months, you're going to walk out of here with $2 million and start your real life. The life you should have had before your brother's mistakes dragged you into this mess. And I'll go back to my work, my empty penthouse, my organized life. That was always the plan. Maybe I don't want that plan anymore, Genevieve shouted back. Maybe I want this to be real. Maybe I'm in love with you and the thought of leaving breaks my heart, and I can't keep pretending that what we have is just business when it stopped being business, the first night we made love. The words hung in the air between them, raw and honest and terrifying. Edward stared at her, his expression cycling through shock, fear, and something that looked almost like hope before settling on cold resolution. You're not in love with me, he said flatly. You're grateful because I helped you, and you're confusing gratitude with affection. It's a common mistake. Don't you dare tell me what I feel, Genevieve said, her voice shaking with fury and hurt. I know the difference between gratitude and love. I love you, Edward. I love your ridiculous attention to detail and the way you can't work without your reading glasses. I love how you defend me without hesitation and how gentle you are with me despite your reputation for ruthlessness. I love the man you are when you let your guard down, the man who shares his grief and his dreams and his body with me. I love you, and I'm tired of pretending I don't. Then you're a fool, Edward said cruelly. I told you from the beginning, I don't do love, I don't believe in it. It's a fantasy people tell themselves to make sense of biochemical impulses. You want something from me I'm not capable of giving. Or you're too much of a coward to try, Genevieve shot back. Your grandfather was right. You're running scared, and you'll keep running until you've destroyed everything good in your life because you think that's safer than risking your heart. Edward's eyes flashed with anger. My grandfather should mind his own business, and so should you. This is exactly why mixing business and pleasure was a mistake. You've developed expectations I never promised to meet. Then I'll remove myself from the situation, Genevieve said, her decision crystallizing even as her heart shattered. I'll leave. Tonight. You can tell everyone I had a family emergency, or that we realized it wasn't working, or whatever lie you want. I'll sign whatever paperwork your lawyers draw up. But I won't stay here and be your convenient outlet for physical needs while you keep your heart locked away behind walls I'm not allowed to scale. I deserve better than that. And honestly, Edward, so do you. She turned toward her room, but Edward caught her arm. Where will you go? My grandmother's, my apartment. I'll figure it out. Genevieve pulled free of his grasp. Don't worry about fulfilling your end of the contract. Keep your money. I'll find another way to manage. The contract? To hell with the contract. Genevieve whirled back to face him, tears finally spilling down her cheeks. I don't want your money, Edward. I never wanted your money. I wanted you. I wanted late-night conversations in the library and morning coffee and lazy Sunday afternoons reading together. I wanted to be your partner, your friend, your wife. Really, your wife, not just on paper. But you're so determined to keep yourself isolated, so convinced that feeling anything is dangerous, that you can't see what's right in front of you. And what's that? Edward asked, his voice cracking slightly. Someone who loves you. Someone who sees past your money and your power to the man underneath. Someone who thinks you're extraordinary not despite your flaws but because of them. Someone who wants to stay. Genevieve wiped at her tears angrily. But you have to want me to stay, Edward. You have to be willing to let me in. And since you've made it clear you're not, I'm leaving. She disappeared into her room, and Edward stood frozen in the living room, his mind reeling. She loved him. Genevieve loved him. And he'd just thrown it in her face, called her a fool, treated her feelings like they were inconvenient complications to be managed. He'd done exactly what he'd sworn he wouldn't. He'd hurt her. And the worst part was, he'd hurt her because he was terrified. Terrified of needing her. Terrified of the gaping emptiness her leaving would create. Terrified that if he admitted he loved her too, she'd somehow be taken from him the way everyone else he'd ever loved had been taken. Because he did love her. He'd probably loved her since that first night in the library when she'd looked at him without fear or awe. Just gentle understanding. He loved her methodical organization of his chaos, her passion for books, the way she hummed while making coffee. He loved how she'd made his sterile penthouse feel like a home, how she challenged him, how she saw through his armor to the broken boy underneath, and didn't flinch away. And he'd just driven her away because he was too much of a coward to admit any of it. Edward heard movement from Genevieve's room, drawers opening, the sound of her packing. He should stop her. He should march in there, drop to his knees, and beg her to stay. But fear kept him frozen, convinced that even if she stayed, he'd eventually fail her, disappoint her, lose her. Better to let her go now than to watch her leave later when he inevitably couldn't be what she needed. 20 minutes later, Genevieve emerged with a single suitcase. She'd changed into jeans and a sweater, her hair pulled back, her face cleaned of tears, but her eyes red-rimmed and devastated. She stopped in front of him. "I hope you find happiness, Edward," she said quietly. "I really do. I hope one day you realize that love isn't something to fear, but something to fight for. And I hope whoever you finally let into your heart appreciates what a gift that is." She walked toward the door, and Edward found his voice. "Genevieve, wait." She turned, and he saw hope flash across her face. But he couldn't say what she needed to hear, couldn't force the words past the fear constricting his throat. "Thank you, for everything." The hope died in her eyes, replaced by resignation and deep sadness. "Goodbye, Edward." The door closed behind her with a soft click that sounded like the end of the world. Edward stood in the middle of his empty penthouse, empty in a way it had never been before Genevieve, in a way it would never stop being now, and felt something break inside his chest. The next 2 weeks were the worst of Edward's life, and that was saying something for a man who'd lost his parents at 15 and built an empire while still grieving. He went through the motions, worked 14-hour days, attended meetings, closed deals. But everything was gray and meaningless without Genevieve's presence to come home to. The penthouse felt like a mausoleum. Her books were gone from the side tables. The yoga mat stood unused in the corner. The kitchen held no coffee prepared in the French press she'd taught him to use. His bed, where they'd spent so many nights tangled together, felt too big and too cold. He couldn't work in his study because it smelled like her perfume. He couldn't relax in the library because every book reminded him of her animated discussions of plots and characters. He was miserable, and worse, he knew it was entirely his own fault. On the 15th day after Genevieve left, Edward's best friend Marcus, yes, that Marcus, Genevieve's brother who'd turned his life around and become a successful architect, showed up at the penthouse unannounced. "You look like hell," Marcus observed, pushing past Edward into the apartment. "What do you want?" Edward asked, too tired to even be annoyed at the intrusion. "To tell you You're an idiot. Marcus helped himself to the bar, pouring 2 glasses of scotch and pressing one into Edward's hand. You had the best thing that ever happened to you living in this ridiculous penthouse, and you drove her away because you're too scared to admit you have feelings. Your sister told you about our arrangement? Of course she did. I'm her brother. We tell each other everything. Marcus threw himself onto the couch. And before you get all concerned about NDAs and contracts, she didn't share any business details. She just told me she married you to save my stupid ass, and then she fell in love with you. And you're too emotionally stunted to see what's right in front of your face. I see it, Edward said quietly, sinking into a chair. I've always seen it. She's incredible. She's everything I never knew I wanted, and everything I'm terrified of losing. So you pushed her away first. Genius strategy. Marcus rolled his eyes. Do you love her? Yes, Edward admitted, the word tearing out of him. God, yes, I love her. I love everything about her. I can't work, can't sleep, can't function without her here. This place is empty without her laughter and her books and her terrible humming while she makes coffee. I wake up reaching for her and remember she's gone, and it feels like dying. Then why the hell are you sitting here feeling sorry for yourself instead of doing something about it? Because I'll fail her, Edward exploded, surging to his feet. Because everyone I've ever loved has been taken from me, and I can't survive losing her too. Because she deserves someone whole and functional, not a broken workaholic who doesn't know how to be in a relationship. Because I'm terrified that if I admit I need her, the universe will find a way to rip her away, and I won't recover this time. So your plan is what? Live the rest of your life alone and miserable because you're afraid of being hurt? Marcus shook his head. That's not protecting yourself, man. That's just a slow suicide. You're already hurting. You're devastated without her. The only difference is if you get her back, at least you'll be hurting and happy instead of hurting and alone. What if I can't be what she needs? What if you are exactly what she needs, and you're the only one who doesn't see it? Marcus stood, clapping Edward on the shoulder. Look, I know I'm not the best person to give advice. My mistakes are literally what caused this whole situation. But I've learned something from nearly destroying my own life and my family. Regret for what you didn't try is worse than failure from trying. Genevieve loves you. That's a gift. Don't waste it because you're scared. After Marcus left, Edward stood at the windows overlooking the city, his grandfather's words and Marcus's advice echoing in his head. They were both right. He was running, had been running since his parents died, convinced that distance and emotional unavailability were armor against pain. But Genevieve had gotten through anyway. She'd slipped past his defenses with her quiet strength and gentle understanding. And now the walls that were supposed to protect him just kept him isolated with his misery. He loved her. He wanted her back. And if there was even a chance she'd forgive him, he had to try. Edward made a decision. Then he made several phone calls. Then he got in his car and drove. Genevieve's grandmother lived in a small cottage 2 hours north of the city, nestled in a town that probably hadn't changed much since the 1950s. Edward found the address easily enough. He'd had Genevieve's information from her initial application, though he'd never thought he'd need to use it. It was raining when he pulled up, a steady downpour that soaked him through in the 30 seconds it took to walk from his car to the front porch. He stood there dripping, suddenly nervous in a way he hadn't been since he was 15 years old, and knocked. The door opened to reveal Genevieve, wearing worn jeans and an oversized sweater, her hair in a messy bun. She looked tired, like she hadn't been sleeping well, and the sight of the shadows under her eyes that he'd put there made Edward's heart clench. "Edward?" She stared at him in shock. "What are you doing here?" "I'm here to grovel," he said simply. "Can I come in, or would you prefer I do this on your grandmother's porch in the rain?" Genevieve stared at him for a long moment, then stepped aside. He entered the small, warm cottage that smelled like baking, and was filled with the kind of comfort his penthouse had never achieved. An elderly woman, Genevieve's grandmother, looked up from her knitting with interested eyes, but had the grace to excuse herself to another room. Edward stood in the middle of the living room, dripping on the rug, and tried to find words for everything he needed to say. "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry, Genevieve. You were right about everything. I was scared, and I ran, and I hurt you because I was too much of a coward to face my own feelings." "Why are you here, Edward?" Genevieve asked, her voice carefully neutral. "Because I can't do this without you, because my penthouse is empty without you in it, and not just physically. It's soulless and cold, and I am too without you. Because I've been miserable every single day since you left, and I realize that I'm not protecting myself by keeping you away. I'm just punishing us both." He took a step closer, his eyes never leaving hers. "I love you, Genevieve. I'm in love with you. I think I started falling the night you saw through all my armor to the grieving boy underneath, and didn't look away. I love your passion for books and the way you make my impossible life feel manageable. I love how you challenged me and called me out when I was being cruel. I love waking up next to you and drinking coffee you made and doing yoga together and coming home to someone who actually wants me there." Tears were streaming down Genevieve's face now, but she didn't speak, so Edward kept going. "I know I don't deserve another chance. I know I hurt you, and I understand if you can't forgive me. But I'm here to tell you that I was wrong. Love isn't a weakness or a chemical reaction. It's the only thing that makes any of this life worth living. And I love you. I want to spend the rest of my life proving it to you. If you'll let me." "Edward," Genevieve whispered, but he wasn't done. He dropped to his knees on her grandmother's rug, pulling a small box from his jacket pocket. Inside was a vintage emerald ring. Not the cold, expensive diamond he'd given her at their contract wedding, but a family heirloom he'd tracked down through estate sales and private collectors. "This was your grandmother's ring," Edward said. "Not mine. Yours. I found it through a private investigator. She sold it 5 years ago to pay for your college textbooks. I bought it back because I know it means something to you, and I want to give you things that matter, not just things that cost money." He opened the box, revealing the delicate emerald surrounded by small diamonds. "Marry me again, Genevieve, not because of a contract or my grandfather's ultimatum, but because I love you and I want you to be my wife, really my wife. I want to build a life with you. I want late-night conversations in the library and lazy Sunday mornings and fights about whose turn it is to make coffee. I want your books all over my penthouse and your clothes mixed with mine in the closet. I want to teach you to ride a bike and protect you from aggressive geese and listen to you talk about literature until I fall asleep." His voice cracked. "I want everything, Genevieve. The messy, complicated, terrifying, beautiful everything that comes with actually sharing a life. I want to be your partner, your friend, your lover, your husband, not just in name, but in every way that matters. I want forever with you. Please give me the chance to prove I'm worthy of you. Please come home." The silence that followed felt like an eternity. Then Genevieve dropped to her knees in front of him, cupping his face in her hands. "You're an idiot," she said, but she was smiling through her tears. "You're an absolute idiot for letting me walk out that door, and an even bigger idiot for thinking you're not worthy of love." "Is that a yes?" Edward asked, hardly daring to hope. "It's a yes, you beautiful, broken, infuriating man," Genevieve said, and kissed him. The kiss was everything their first kiss should have been, full of love and promise, and the kind of future they'd both been too scared to reach for before. When they finally broke apart, Edward slipped the emerald ring onto her finger, and it fit perfectly, as if it had been waiting all this time to come home. "I love you," Edward said again. Because now that he'd said it once, he couldn't seem to stop. "I love you so much." "I love you too," Genevieve replied, resting her forehead against his. "And we're going to have to work on your communication skills and your tendency to retreat when you're scared. This won't be easy." I know, Edward said, but I'm willing to do the work. I'm willing to go to therapy, to learn how to be vulnerable, to be the partner you deserve. Whatever it takes, Genevieve. I'm not losing you again. They sat on the floor of her grandmother's living room, holding each other, both crying and laughing at the same time. When Genevieve's grandmother peeked in and saw them, she smiled knowingly and closed the door, giving them privacy. "When did you realize," Genevieve asked eventually, "that you loved me?" "Honestly, I think I've been in love with you since that first night in the library, but I didn't let myself acknowledge it until you were gone and I realized my life had become unbearable without you in it. Marcus came to yell at me and your grandfather had already told me I was an idiot when I visited him in the hospital. I was outvoted by people who actually know something about functional relationships." Genevieve laughed. "Marcus came to yell at you? Your brother has strong opinions about my emotional intelligence, or lack thereof." Edward pulled her closer. "Come home with me, please, or I'll move here. I don't care where we live as long as we're together. But please don't make me spend another night without you." "We need to do this right this time," Genevieve said seriously. "Real conversations, real vulnerability, real partnership." "Whatever you want," Edward promised. "I'll give you whatever you want." "I just want you," Genevieve said simply. "The real you, not the version you show the rest of the world. I want the man who sketches buildings at 3 a.m. and makes terrible coffee and tells me about his dreams and fears and everything in between." "You have him," Edward said, pressing a kiss to her forehead. "You've had him all along. I was just too stupid to admit it." They returned to the city that night, to the penthouse that had felt so empty, but now seemed to come alive with Genevieve's return. And this time, instead of retreating to separate rooms, they went together to Edward's bedroom, their bedroom now, and made love with a tenderness and openness they'd never allowed before. Afterward, Edward held Genevieve against his chest, his fingers trailing through her hair. "Thank you for not giving up on me." "Thank you for finally letting me in," Genevieve replied, kissing his chest. They talked through the night, really talked for the first time, about their fears and hopes and everything they wanted from their future together. Edward admitted he'd always wanted children but was terrified he'd fail them the way he felt his own father had failed him by dying. Genevieve shared her dream of starting a literacy foundation for underprivileged children. They made plans, real plans, for a real life together. As dawn broke over the city, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold, Edward looked at the woman asleep in his arms and felt something he hadn't felt in 20 years. Hope, not just for success or achievement, but for genuine happiness. For a life filled with love instead of just accomplishments. 3 months later, they stood in a small garden chapel, surrounded by family and friends, and renewed their vows. This time there was nothing contractual or cold about the ceremony. This time, when the officiant pronounced them married and Edward kissed his bride, it was a promise of forever. This time, when they said "I do," they both meant it with every fiber of their beings. Genevieve wore a simple white dress and carried wildflowers. Edward wore a suit, but no tie. Genevieve had convinced him to be a little less formal. Jonathan Blackstone sat in the front row, fully recovered and beaming with pride at his grandson, who'd finally figured out what really mattered. Marcus stood as best man, still occasionally marveling that his mistake had ultimately led to his sister's happiness. At the reception, Edward pulled Genevieve aside for a moment alone. "Happy," deliriously, she said, standing on her toes to kiss him. "You?" "More than I ever thought possible," Edward admitted. "Thank you for being stubborn enough to break through my walls and patient enough to let me find my way to you." 2 years later, they stood in the nursery of their new home. They'd left the cold penthouse for a brownstone in a neighborhood with actual trees and children playing in the streets. Their son, Jonathan Thomas Blackstone, named for both his great-grandfather and the grandfather he'd never meet, slept peacefully in his crib. Genevieve was 8 months pregnant with their daughter, who they'd already decided to name Evelyn after Edward's mother. Edward's arms wrapped around Genevieve from behind, his hands resting on her swollen belly. "I can't believe this is my life," he murmured against her hair. "Believe it," Genevieve said, leaning back against him. "This is what happens when you let yourself love and be loved." "Best decision I ever made," Edward said. "Well, second best. First was hiring your aunt so she could recommend you as my contract wife." Genevieve laughed. "Still can't believe that's how we met. Imagine if I'd said no." "I would have tracked you down and convinced you," Edward said confidently. "Somehow, someway, we would have found each other. I'm sure of it." They stood together watching their son sleep, wrapped in each other's arms, already laughing about the chaos that would come when their daughter arrived. Edward's company was thriving, but he'd learned to delegate, to leave work at work, to prioritize family dinner over late nights at the office. Genevieve had started her literacy foundation with Edward's full support and active involvement. They'd built not just a marriage, but a partnership, not just a house, but a home. And on quiet nights when they lay tangled together in their bed, Edward still sometimes whispered against Genevieve's skin, "Thank you for not giving up on me," and she always replied, "Thank you for finally letting me in." Their story had started with a cold contract and a business transaction, but it had become the greatest love story of their lives, proof that sometimes the best things come from the most unexpected places, and that love, real love, is always worth fighting for. Like, comment, and subscribe for more romance stories. Did Edward and Genevieve's journey from a cold contract to passionate forever touch your heart? Drop a comment below telling us your favorite moment from their story. Like this story, if you believe in second chances and love that conquers fear, comment, which part made your heart race the most? Was it their first night together, Edward's rain-soaked proposal, or their emotional reconnection? Subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss our next captivating romance. We post new billionaire, contemporary, and heartwarming love stories every week. Share this story with someone who loves emotional, steamy romance with a happy ending. Want more stories like this? Check out our playlist of billionaire romance stories for more passionate tales of unexpected love, second chances, and happily ever afters. Your support helps us create more content you love. Thank you for being part of our romance-loving community.